Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon your time zone. Welcome to session 7 of our 7-part series on AI engineering, AI in the enterprise. Today, we're talking about how to pull it all together in terms of a pilot and a readiness architecture. So this is going to show you how we can do this in a very short time, 12-week initiative. This should be the template for other types of projects and programs that you want to do. It's intentionally kept narrowly bounded and scoped and focused on this 12-week time period. So that makes it very, very definable. So we need to understand what the content is, what the process is, what we're supporting, and we'll talk about all of those things in just a moment. I'm Seth Earley. I'm the founder and CEO of Earley Information Science. I'm here with Heather Eisenbraun, who is our Chief Knowledge Architect around AI initiatives. This is being recorded. We're going to try to go 50 minutes if we can. We have a lot of material, so we might end up brushing up against the top of the hour, but you can always ask questions in the Q&A tab, so feel free to do that. And then we will have some surveys and polls, so please be sure to fill those out. We want to thank our media partners, Vector, VKTR, and CMS Wire. So EIS is a professional services firm, and it's been in the space for decades. So we've always been talking about information architecture, information management, taxonomy, metadata, product data, knowledge architecture, and all the related processes, including metrics and governance. So this has been our sweet spot throughout our history. And a lot of the principles and approaches that we've pioneered and developed and built thought leadership around and researched and so on has always been, is currently exactly what the enterprise needs, exactly what the industry needs to make AI work effectively. So this is stuff we've been doing for a long time. So we have lots of methodologies, templates, frameworks, approaches, and that's what's been so powerful about things like Claude and large language models. We've ingested our IP into those systems to guide any functionality we have. And you're going to hear about how we can do these projects in such a short time by using this combination of IP methodologies and large language models in order to apply human judgment in an automated fashion. So it's a very exciting time and it's a very exciting process. If you have attended the other sessions, more power to you. There's been 6 other sessions, but this is really arguably the most important one. And if you can attend any at all, this is the one to attend. So feel free to pass this on to your colleagues and your partners and your network. But again, this is where we are. It's talking about pulling all these pieces together, looking at information architecture directed RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. And we're going to be talking about how that is so critical because, again, AI initiatives are only as good as the content and data that is retrieved. And if that content and data is not in the right format, structure, quality, it's not going to work. So, we're also working in the e-commerce space, and many people don't realize that search at its core is the engine behind any type of AI assistant, any type of agentic search. So we need to fix search at the core, which is really what this initiative does. This does it looking at content. We can also do this with product data, product information management processes, e-commerce search, and so on. So there's a lot of great reusable principles here. But again, search is the retrieval layer for any AI, and search depends on the principles that we're talking about. That content needs to be structured and curated. So we're going to talk today about, we've talked up till now about all of these different pieces, right? Governance framework, how we engineer content, how we do activate knowledge and take that knowledge from tacit to explicit, and then to engineered content that can be retrieved. A pilot and evaluation. So where are you in the process? What does your current state look like? What are the current metrics, right? One of the things that's really super important is understanding baselines for a particular process, and then being able to roll that into a go forward plan that enables you to build that foundation as you go, have the right structures in place, have the right governance framework, have the right metrics, and really have an objective way to determine how successful your initiative is. So this is, again, it's a 5-phase process that we're going to be talking about throughout this session. And it starts with governance, but it ends up with this roadmap and this implementation. Today, we're going to talk about why the architecture is always more important than the model itself, right? Enterprise AI is looking at your content and that content structure. What does good look like? How are we going to define success? This is based on use cases and the users. And we're going to talk about how we set the right use cases and how those use cases determine how we structure that information, the schema, the metadata, the taxonomy. All of those things are dependent and driven by use cases. And that's what determines what good looks like. At the end of the day, what is your system going to be able to do? Can the users accomplish their tasks? And if so, what's the impact on that process? We'll talk about how we scope a pilot and how we show that pilot provides value, and then use that pilot as a blueprint for scale. So you can use this as that template. And then the benchmarks. Why the benchmarks are so important? Because what we're trying to do is not just demo a capability, but show a measurable improvement. This is where a lot of demos fall down. This is where a lot of pilots fall down. They don't show the measurable outcome and the measurable improvement. And so the benchmark is saying, where are you today? How are we instrumented? And how are we looking at the foundational, the current state metrics so that we can compare this to a future state? And then we'll talk about how IA really makes that retrieval work in a trustworthy way so that we understand the boundaries of what we're doing. We have escalation processes and triggers. We avoid hallucinations, and all of those things are critical to this process. So again, when we talked about benchmarks, and we say this, if you can't benchmark it, if you don't say what that impact is, then it's not really a pilot. It is a demo, and it could be a good demo. But what we're trying to do is show that in a time box, deliverable-driven proof of value, or however we want to talk about this, we have the ability to show what is working. And this is benchmark against ground truth. So we understand what that core metric is. What are we measuring? What is the current state? And then when we do this and we are able to deploy, even if it's on a limited basis, we can validate that outcome. We can show the impact. We can show the evidence. So that is so critically important. It's the one thing, if you want to take away anything, that's it. It's saying, how do we benchmark it? How do we measure the current state? And then what is that future state going to look like? And then how will we show that? How will we prove that? And we've talked about the different dimensions of, or different domains of null AI readiness. And this pilot will show you how all of these pieces fit together, because we want to make sure we have that knowledge foundation. We want to make sure we understand how we integrate with operations and operational processes, especially around subject matter experts. We need to make sure that that technical foundation is in place, that we're able to integrate this with our systems. And then we have the governance processes that are going to show how we can make ongoing improvements and how we can iterate and refine and allocate resources and make sure we're getting the right return on the investments that we're making. So these are all elements of what this pilot will look like. And again, it's always a matter of depth and detail, right? We're not going to deeply integrate into your technical infrastructure in a 12-week pilot, but maybe we can, and we certainly need to integrate with whatever you have in your environment, because many times we're doing this in a sandbox environment in your organization. So there has to be some integration with those processes, but it really depends on the depth and the detail of that. We have our first poll, and what I want to do is understand, how have you defined success in the past? Have you defined use cases and baselines and measured the ROI against those targets? Have you defined use cases but not necessarily measured against the baselines? Maybe you have a broad set of those metrics, but you're still gathering the data. Maybe you ran experiments, but didn't benchmark them because you were just doing experiments. So any of these, and then if there's something else, just let us know. And you can let us know in the Q&A tab. So what have you done? Have you been able to do this in such a way that you measure your baseline, that you measure outcome, and then you compare that so that you can show that there's a value? Or conversely, that you were not able to show value, right? It's not always going to be, and maybe you need to adjust and evolve and refine and iterate, right? But that's what metrics will tell you. If it tells you that you did not improve a process, that's okay. Now you have to go back and deconstruct and say, well, why didn't it help us improve that process? Why weren't we able to show the value? I'll give you another moment or two just to finish this up. But we have a pretty good distribution. Maybe there's one more coming, one more, last call, going once, going twice, sold to the woman in the back. All right. We didn't get a number. Okay, so here we are. A pretty reasonable distribution, but it looks like people are defining use cases, which is great. And you are measuring the ROI against the targets. Now, that could be all in process. Now, the question is, can you scale that to the enterprise, right? Because that is, you've done the proof points there, but now the question is, what's holding it back from scaling? Because it may have been an inordinate level of effort to get there. So I'm going to stop sharing the results. Nobody said something else, so that's good. And let's continue to move onward and upward. As I said, we have to measure what good looks like. What does good look like? What is it at the end of the day this is going to do? What are people going to say? Yes, that was successful. Awesome. Let's do it again, or let's do more of it, or I want that as well. And good is defined by the user and the use case. It's defined by the user and the use case. That's it. What are they trying to do? At the end of the day, what are they able to do? And then what we can do is we can tie this into, and this is where the problem is always coming from. I was teaching a session recently at the Knowledge Management Council. And one of the things they said was, look, how do we go from data to the business outcome? Because there's no direct correlation sometimes, right? So people will say, well, how is this going to increase revenue? How's this going to reduce costs? Maybe some of you have seen this slide before. It was nicely redesigned and polished, but same slide. But now we're working in the weeds, right? We're saying, how do we know AI is working? How do we know search is working? How do we know taxonomy, content, information architecture? Those are all components that need to be in place in order for this to be successful. But you can't necessarily measure the impact at that level. But what we can do is we can measure the quality of the data. We can have scorecards around data completeness, data quality, attribute alignment, taxonomy, any type of search. We can measure those things at that level. And then, of course, data and content will support a process. And this is where we can now start saying, well, how did we impact this process? What was the impact on conversions? Or what was the impact on search relevance? What was the impact on the process? Because data is always supporting a process. If you can't talk about what process that your data and content are supporting, then you're kind of on the wrong stack of mail to begin with, right? So you need to make sure that there's a process that you have in mind. Processes enable a business outcome. So what is it that we're doing? This is where I like to say that you either executives either get a bonus, or as my colleague Chris Penn says, you catalyze a resume generating event. So this is where the rubber meets the road for executives. And then of course that aligns with the strategy, right? So you have lots of different business initiatives, and those all have to have metrics. And what's critical here is the linkage up and down that food chain, right? We call this our metrics layer cake, but it connects the data and the low level of granular metric all the way up through the process, the outcome, and then the strategy. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind. And you may understand this linkage, but most people do not. They don't think of it this way. They don't understand it. It may be intuitive to you. It may be obvious to you, but it's not obvious to other people. So that's why we have to spell it out. So Heather, you're going to be talking about this. So I'm going to turn it over to you now. And how do you want me to build this? Do you want to talk about it and then say next click?
Nope, you can just build it as you like. But you just said good is defined by the user and the use case and not the model. And this slide shows where the use cases actually come from and what they drive. So if you're starting on the left, you have a process you're trying to improve, and the process breaks down into tasks and discrete steps. And out of those come the use cases. And that use case is the unit of work. It's the thing that AI has to do well. And here's why that center matters. Everything to the left produces the use case, and everything to the right is dictated by them. So the content you need and the metadata that makes it findable are determined by the use case, not the other way around. So when someone asks, what content and metadata do we need? The honest answer is, it depends on the use case. So the use case is the question. Everything else is just in service of answering it. So think of it like a test question with a known right answer. The content is your notes. Metadata is how your notes are organized, so you can find the right page under pressure. So a use case has a simple three-part shape. As a someone, I need to do something in order to achieve something. So here the example is, as a service technician, I need to understand alarm code is 76 on the FW2000 in order to resolve the issue and return the unit to service. And we write them this way because it forces clarity. You know the role, the action, and the outcome with no ambiguity about what success looks like. And the test I'd give you for a good use case, can you grade it? A good one resolves cleanly to I can do it or I can't do it. So either the technician can resolve that alarm or they can't. Testable is what makes the pilot provable later instead of just demoable. So there are three ways a use case can drift out of the testable zone. so you know what to watch for. If it's too granular and you're describing a singular click, it's not a unit of work. If it's too high level, like improved service, then there's nothing concrete to test. And if it's too ambiguous and two reasonable people would grade it differently, then that's not going to help you either. So none of those are failures. They're just signals to take another pass, revising your use cases. It's like writing a good exam question. It's too narrow and it's trivial, too broad, and you can't write the answer key.
And this is so, so critical because everything hinges on this. And you're going to build libraries of use cases. You're going to build hundreds of use cases. Use cases become an asset of increasing value because they can be used for job descriptions. Guess what else they're used for? Agentic technologies, agents. What you're doing is you're describing the activities and the tasks that a human would do. You're also describing the activities and the tasks that an agent would execute. So use cases are critically, critically important. And what Heather said is they can't be ambiguous. Like using AI is ambiguous, right? It's high level, it's ambiguous, it's not executable. You can't determine true or false or yes or no or could do it or couldn't do it. Being able to define it in such a way that is measurable and has an unambiguous outcome. And again, that is what's so critically important for building agentic technologies because we have to have clear objectives. We have to have clear understanding. Let's see, I have one. I'm wondering if we're measuring AI readiness or we're measuring the enterprise ability to slow AI down until it resembles the software products it already knows how to manage. When measuring AI readiness, well, we do have to measure AI readiness. And we do need to slow things down because yes, it does entail many of the things that an existing software initiative will entail. Right. So what we need to do is we need to understand, number one, what is the condition of each of the supporting domains of capability? So governance, knowledge, operational and technical readiness. And when we look at that, then we can start to identify, well, if we don't have our one of those domains in shape, now we have to go back and remediate. So the point here is it's not necessarily, it is slowing it down, right? It is slowing because you don't want to run out and do pilots and POCs without these elements. So yes, and you're right. It is resembling the software, the projects that people already know, that they know how to do. So that's where, it is going back and saying, this is not just, brand new. This does need to leverage things that we've done in the past.
So this use case, the one we just talked about, tells you exactly what metadata you need. Our technician needs to know what the alarm means on this particular unit called the Frostwin FW2000 and how to fix it. Simple enough. But here's the catch. Different units have different procedures for the same alarm codes. So if the system doesn't know the exact unit, it can hand the technician the right alarm and the wrong fix. And that risk is what generates the list on the right. So you have to know the manufacturer, the series, the model, the document type, the subsystem, the component, and the alarm code. Every field is there because the use case requires it to return the right answer. And it maps cleanly back to the last slide. So document type is the isness, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, the reassuring part here is you don't have to tag everything in the manual. You tag what the use case requires, and that keeps the work bounded.
And Heather just talked about isness and aboutness. And what is this thing? It's a manual. Well, what if I have 100 manuals in a pile? How do I tell them apart, right? Or if I have hundreds of procedures in a manual, how do I tell those apart, right? So what we're trying to do is say, what piles, like if I have contracts, I have 1,000 contracts, what other piles will I put those contracts in order to tell them apart? Well, it could be purchase and sale contract. It could be an employment contract. It could be a services contract, any kind of descriptor that lets us tell these things apart. That's what's important. And that's what we're seeing when we build this kind of metadata model. The service case is perfect. We've designed and are implementing one now on an LLM, no agents, and it exists at the individual level. We ran into the exact same challenge you illustrate. Okay, great. So Greg, thank you for that comment. And so again, what you're trying to, that's fine. No agents. That's fine. You don't need to use agents. My point about agents was that you need these for the agents, but the challenge is, how do you tell that content apart, and how do you allow the system, the agent itself? When I say agent now, I'm talking about the bot, right? The retrieval mechanism. How can it tell these things apart so it can give the user exactly what they need.
Right. So just to reinforce what Seth is already saying, two simple ideas do a lot of work, right? Isness, what is the piece of content? It's a service manual. Aboutness is what it's about. Take our alarm. It's about this piece of equipment, the FW2000, the condenser motor, this alarm. Why do we need both isness and aboutness? Because the document type alone isn't enough and the topic alone isn't enough. You need to know it's a service manual and that it covers a specific this exact unit and this exact alarm. And here's the part that can trip people up, and it's that AI doesn't retrieve the document; it retrieves a chunk, the specific packet passage in the content. So, is this an aboutness has to be present all the way down to the chunk level, not just like stamped on the cover. So, the passage that says check continuity between PM30 and PM11 only helps if the system knows that chunk is from a service manual for this unit for this. Okay, so Seth kind of already gave you a preview of this too, but let me tie the last few slides together. We've been building one use case at a time and showing you how it's practical. But in practice, you build a library of them. And these are the real questions your users actually ask. And that library does double duty. It defines what good looks like, so you know when your pilot is working, and it defines your schema. So the set of metadata fields and terms you actually need. And sometimes you'll see this order flipped, and a team will start by designing the perfect taxonomy, and then you're looking for uses, right? But it's best to start with the use cases and let them tell you exactly what the schema has to contain. Nothing more, nothing less. The use case library is your answer key, and the schema just makes sure your files are organized to answer exactly those questions.
This is so, so important because we're identifying the user, the action, the objective, the content they need to satisfy the objective, and then the structure of that content so that it can be very, very precisely retrieved. And you see, manufacturer is a field, right? It's a piece of metadata. It's a piece of aboutness, right? The alarm code is a field on that document, right? The document has been tagged. That chunk has been tagged. The component, all of these things are the pieces of aboutness that need to be used in order to retrieve exactly what you want. So the use case. So again, you can't. I used to do a workshop where I would ask our participants to build a metadata schema for a an invoice, and what they would do is they would start rebuilding the whole accounting management system on this invoice, and I'd say, well, wait a minute, what is your use case? The use case is I just need to find the invoice. Well, then all you need is the invoice number, right? The customer number, the invoice. Now go to the accounting system, right? So if you don't have a use case that tells you what metadata you need, you cannot have that metadata. You don't need that metadata, right? You don't need those tags. So use cases determine everything. So now we're going to go into the 5-phase process, right? Talk about current state, and getting the baseline. Again, this can be done very quickly. We don't want to spend inordinate amounts of time. All of these things are accelerated. Then we'll talk about the design of the information architecture. We'll talk about applying that to the content. We'll get into what the retrieval augmented generation pilot looks like. I was at a conference and I was asking people, do you know what RAG is? And people don't know what RAG is. RAG is the source of truth. You're not asking the large language model, the AI, to just answer a question based on its training and its knowledge. That's where you're going to hallucinate. That's where it doesn't have the knowledge that you need because that knowledge is protected IP or should be. Now, again, increasingly organizations are finding their IP is out there being used to train these language models, but they still need the structure because it's not precise enough. So retrieval augmented generation says, don't ask the LLM for the answer. Ask the LLM to go get you the answer. And that is a retrieval and search process. And so you're letting the large language model interpret what the user wants and then make the answer more conversational, but really it's going after your content. And that's what is so important here. Then we'll talk about scaling to the roadmap. So how do we do discovery? Well, we have a bunch of diagnostic instruments. We do walkthroughs, and we do a schema evaluation, and we talk to users, and we analyze the content. These are the elements of discovery, right? We ask people questions, we walk through the systems, we look at the content, we look at the schema and the data. So these are different instruments that we have. So some of you may have seen the quick check diagnostic. This is looking broadly at the capabilities of the organization across those 4 domains we showed earlier: knowledge, governance, operations, and technical infrastructure, right? And what we're saying is that we wrote a white paper on this, that a level 4 technology stack will not overcome a level 2 of knowledge readiness. So you need to have maturity in these areas. And that's where you can diagnose that we have a problem and then show what it takes to do this. So this is a self-assessment. This is a good place to start. this is a good place to distribute to multiple people in the organization. It gives you that understanding of not only the maturity readiness, but also the disparity in people's perspectives, because you can get wildly varying answers depending upon who you ask this question of. There's another tool that we use. It's called the AIRR10, Artificial Intelligence Retrieval Readiness 10-factor scorecard. What this does is it looks at the content. It looks at how ready that content is for retrieval, how visible it will be to either agentic search externally or to your RAG search. And if it doesn't have good scores, if it scores very poorly, this is a 1 to 10 scoring mechanism. If it's scoring below 4, it's invisible. Your AI will not see it. And so you need to look at these different elements, and we can talk about that more individually with you. Then we have a full diagnostic. This is a 74 questions, 4 domains, 70 factors. This is not something that we give people to fill out, right? The first one people fill out, that's not a big deal. This comes from discussions. This comes from walkthroughs. This comes from all the different ways of understanding your processes. And this is part of the discovery, but it's ingested into a large language model that uses this rubric, uses this scoring system and these questions, and then there are descriptors of what each stage looks like. This is incredibly powerful. This is where we've ingested our 30 years of IP into large language models and built out our named frameworks and our structures and our methodologies and our templates and our approaches. And all of this allows us to do things like do the quick check diagnostic, for $2,500 instead of $25,000, right? So these are all things that do this. And the AIRR will let you know the readiness, but it doesn't, it informs the readiness, but it does not come from it. That is a separate view of the content itself. So just think of these as ways of understanding your current state and scoring that current state. Do you want to add anything to that, Heather? No.
No, those were great descriptions.
All right, and then we want to understand what the users are saying, what they need. Where's the undocumented expertise? There's a lot of it in people's heads, and much of it is walking out the doors. We hear that all the time. Somebody at this conference said, I have 60-year-old experts in life sciences who are working in this this high tier of support. They're going to be gone in a couple of years, right? What do we do with that? And there's not a lot of people coming up through the ranks to do this. So we need to understand that. And then we need to understand, well, what are the real use cases? What do people actually do day to day? What are their bottlenecks? What are their obstacles? What are their workarounds? And the conversation feeds everything, right? It's not like you're going back and iterating through this and say, oh, now I need to do use cases. Oh, now I need to do diagnostic. All of that feeds all of the other pieces, right? They feed maturity models in diagnostics as well as the use cases. So we're always looking for, what problems people have, what's that future state, what's that ideal situation, and then, what are the things that people need to do at the end of the day. So here is where we again think about use cases, because the use cases are saying this is what the user needs. And then the idea of what schema is required. Like you saw that before. You saw the use case says, I need this content. And then the content and the use case determine the schema. So we need to understand what metadata is needed to support that schema. We also have the ability to look the other way. We have to say, what schema do these use cases require? So what do they support? We can look at the schema and say, what use cases they support? We can say that, look at the schema and say, what do these use cases require? So these use cases need to have that isness and aboutness defined, and it will give you that level of granularity and understanding where the current schema is. What is the current schema supporting today versus what does the schema need to support regarding use cases? That is telling you what the gap is. And again, if we don't have a specific use case for a piece of metadata, we don't need that metadata. And if we don't have metadata support the use case, we need the metadata, right? So that's kind of how those work at both sides. Now we're going to talk about semantic layer design, and notice again, we're talking like 3-4 weeks to build that baseline. Now we're talking, another few weeks to build the semantic layer. Heather, you want to begin that? Should I move to the next slide, or you want to talk about this?
Yep. So phase 2 produces 3 concrete deliverables, and I want to be specific because semantic layer kind of sounds abstract until you see what you actually get. So first, the domain glossary is a canonical governed list of terms for your domain. It's as many terms as you need for the use cases, but it's not thousands of terms. We're not boiling the ocean here. Seth's guidance.
Canonical. I'm sorry. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say your guidance has usually been a couple hundred at most is what you need.
And when we say canonical, that's like the defined term because you can have a lot of derivations, you can have a lot of variations, you can have a lot of synonyms. So, statement of work is SOW, is proposal. What is the defined official term? So when we say canonical, it's the highest level defined official term, and you can have other derivative terms from that.
Great point. Thanks for pointing that one out. So the second thing is the metadata schema, and that's the piece that maps query types, user questions, to the content structures that answer them. So it's the bridge between what users ask and where the answer lives. And all three, these come straight from the use case library as well. And the third is an information architecture, which is the categories and the relationships between them. It's a map of your content, and the structure, it's a structure, not just a keyword list. So it's how things are related. And we're going to look at a high level example of that next. So if we can, yeah, build through, this is what a purpose built information architecture looks like. It's not a flat list of tags, but it's entities. In this case, there's three core entities: a service job, a unit model, and a document, each carrying only the attributes that define it and that are needed by the use cases. So in our example, the service job is the technician's work on alarm 000. The unit model is the Frost Wind FW2000, and the document is a service manual that applies to it, right? So the dotted lines are what make this an architecture, not a glossary. The job points to a unit, the unit resolves to a model, and the model points to exactly the document that applies. So that chain is how retrieval travels from this job, this unit, to this exact page of a document. And every field here earned its place against a use case. And that's why it's this compact and this specific. If our use cases don't need it, we retire it, and we map synonyms to one preferred term so the system isn't guessing.
Here's a quick question. Does information architecture mean data model and data dictionary? Yes, that is inclusive in that, but architecture also includes other things. So navigational structures, it can include workflow processes. The thing that I always say is when we start at the data model, we start at too granular a level. And I'll give you an example of that. So I talk about SharePoint as a system, right? As a system. And then we have concepts and business concepts. Starts with the business glossary. What is an important business concept to say, professional services firm like ours? Methodology. And methodology is about everything, right? It's about all the ways that we do things. But you could have a site collection called methodology that then has other sites that have different types of methodologies. Maybe there's methodology for discovery, methodologies for different types of analyses, and so on. We could also have a site that's called methodology. And within that site, it'll have, again, libraries, and those libraries are about different methodology. We can have a library that's called methodology. We could have a content type within a library called methodology. We could have a metadata field called methodology, or we could have a term within a vocabulary that drives that metadata field called methodology. So methodology is a concept that gets designed into the information architecture at multiple levels. So many times when people say, oh, I want to add a term to the taxonomy, that's not what they mean, right? Because it could be an object of some sort. It could be a process. It could be many other things. So it's very important to understand that if we start at that data architecture level, we're starting at a too granular level and we miss all of those other constructs. Okay. And again, we're trying to score we need to understand what this IA looks like, right? So this is where it's so critical. Did you want to talk about this, Heather? I think there's.
Yeah. So if you've attended one of our other sessions in the series, you might be familiar with this term, but for everyone else, I want to introduce IAD-RAG, and it stands for Information Architecture Directed Retrieval Augmented Generation. Long name, simple idea. Regular RAG means that the AI looks something up before it answers, instead of answering from memory, right? But IAD-RAG adds one word that changes everything, and that's directed. The retrieval is directed by your information architecture. So instead of grabbing whatever looks similar, the system retrieves within the structure we built, the type knowledge, the governed terms, and the engineered content. And that's the difference between letting the AI wander the warehouse and handing it the exact aisle and shelf. So everything we just built in phase 2 is what makes that possible.
I love that. I love that. And letting the AI, instead of letting the AI wander the warehouse randomly, you're giving it the row and the shelf. I love it. That's such a great metaphor.
Okay, so we put these two side by side, and I want to say up front, if you've built a system that works the way the left column describes, there's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of been the default behavior. It's where almost everyone starts. It's a sensible place to begin. But generic RAG retrieves on similarity. It finds passages that look most like the question and generates an answer from them. So the result is usually plausible. The challenge is that the plausible and correct aren't usually the same things, and it's not always easy to tell the difference. IAD-RAG retrieves within the boundaries, and because we've defined the structure, the system isn't pulling whatever looks relevant, it's pulling from the right place by design. So within those limits, it's deterministic, which is a fancy way of saying you get the same right answer every time. So if you search for the word cold, you'll get common cold and cold weather. They're similar, but yet only one is relevant. So information architecture is what lets the system tell those two apart. Okay, so here's a difference made concrete. A technician asks, what's triggering alarm 1 on the 7700? So I switched it up on you, the error code in the model here. But I wanted to use a real example, and this is one I encountered from our backlog. So generic RAG here's alarm and troubleshoot, and it's returning a generic alarm troubleshooting procedure. It's not wrong, but it's not the answer the technician needed at the time, right? They're standing in front of the 7700 with a specific error code, right? The IAD RAG uses the metadata, document type service manual, trouble type alarm, alarm code 0001 to retrieve the specific steps for that specific alarm. That's an answer the technician can act on. Same question, same underlying documents. The only difference is whether the system was directed by structure. And that's really the whole argument in one example.
And it's so funny. I get a lot of companies, a lot of vendors and technology vendors coming to us saying, "We love your stuff. We love your approach. We're all over this. We believe in knowledge architecture. We believe in componentized content. We believe in in IAD RAG. We believe in all these things, and we want to partner with you and use our technology." And they say, "Okay, that's great." And they give me all the right videos, and they give me all the right marketing materials, and all the right presentations that are beautiful and perfectly illustrate the points. And I say, "Okay, here's some content, and here's some use cases. Now show me what you can do," because that's where the rubber meets the road. And inevitably, invariably, they've failed, and they've failed miserably. And one of them said, "Well, that's because your data is bad." Like, hello, welcome to the real world. That is what data looks like, right? You can't blame your inability to do this on my content because that's my content, period, full stop, right? Yeah, I need to do some remediation, but if I have thousands and thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of pages of PDFs, I have to deal with it. It is what it is, right? I can't go back and change all of that. I need to solve the problem now. So one vendor gave me, like, for this answer, it was 5 pages of documentation all about. That's worthless. That's not what the technician needs. The technician is not going to go through 5 pages of documents. Now they want the answer, right? And again, another one told me all about the chunks and all about the corpus and told me all this other stuff, did not give me the answer. And that's happened multiple times. So there's organizations that say they can do this. This is the key proof point. Can they do it with your use case and your content to the degree that it satisfies your user and not some theoretical construct, right? Because all of this looks great on paper. It's very difficult to do in practice. That's why it requires, we use 6 different large language models to do processing of different aspects of these documents, because that's what it takes. It's not a single large language model. It takes multiple different approaches and algorithms. So now that comes back to transforming the content, because we do have to do the transformation of the content, and we do the transformation of the content in the tool. Right? This is where it does happen, but it doesn't happen. It's not like I'm giving people transform content and go do your pilot on this. It's like I'm starting with raw content and then I need to transform it.
So this is the step that does the heavy lifting. And the term is componentization. So taking content written as prose and turning it into typed, machined, actionable, and readable units. So in our service manual, that means pulling apart the alarm codes, the corrective actions, the individual steps, the hazards, and so on. So each becomes its own labeled unit instead of being buried in a paragraph. And then we apply the metadata schema to those units and chunk the content so the meaning stays intact. And that last part matters because naive chunking can split a procedure right down the middle. And when you split the information, you're not going to get a complete answer. We have to chunk so a complete thought stays together. And what you end up with is a structured, engineered corpus. And it's the knowledge base that the pilot can retrieve from. It's like taking a recipe that's written in paragraph form and just breaking it into the fields you're used to, right? Ingredients, quantities, steps, temperatures, timers. You can muddle through the paragraph, right? It's not impossible, but a machine benefits from the explicit fields.
And when we talk about doing this in componentization, this is semantically meaningful chunks that answer a specific question. So that's what you're trying to do, build question answer pairs. So you have a question, and then this chunk This little piece of content is the answer. And that requires that we look at different types of chunking strategies. Whenever you bring content into a large language model, it breaks it up anyway, but it breaks it up in what Heather was calling a naive way. In other words, it'll do it based on a fixed length. It'll do it based on paragraphs. It'll do it. There's a whole bunch of different ways to chunk content. But what we want is semantically chunked content so that we can build these components that allow us to build question answer systems.
So this is the before and after, and I love this slide because you see the transformation despite it being a bit of an eye chart. So on the left is the raw service manual content for the alarm 00076. On the right is the same alarm content after componentization. So when you look at the raw version, everything a technician needs is technically there. It's written for a human who can infer, skim, flip pages. It's not bad documentation. This is traditionally how documentation has been written. It's just documentation written for people and not machines. So the right side is the same information made explicit and structured. So there are 5 things AI can't resolve without structure. And the first is branch logic, like if open, continue with step 6. It's trapped in sentence, right? But if it's componentized, it becomes an explicit branch the system could follow. The second is references, like refer to section 8, 10, 10. It points somewhere else, but when it's componentized, you don't really have a section 8, 10, 10 anymore. So when componentized, the reference is resolved. Measurements like 0 ohms are just words in prose, but componentized, they're machine readable values. Variants like engine versus electric versions of the product get lost in the paragraph. Componentized, we can call them out so that they each have their own clear path. And then content split across pages could very easily get cut in half, as a lot of them do chunk at a page level, but we can do it so componentization keeps those connected steps together. So those are 5 very specific, very fixable reasons a generic system gives a shaky answer, right? Or something that might not be quite completely accurate and exactly what phase 3 resolves. However, Seth, doing this sort of work by hand across a large corpus has traditionally either taken forever or maybe labeled as unfeasible before an initiative was ever begun.
Yes. Yes.
What do
That
you
is
have for us?
Yes, that is the critical factor here, because in the olden days, when you had to do this by hand, this could be millions of dollars, right? This is millions of dollars of work to do this stuff. Now, what we are doing is we're using tools with methodologies. So I mentioned before that we've extracted our IP. So I have a book. That book has been ingested into a Claude project and extract in the information and processes and procedures and approaches and methodologies extracted from that. I have 100 either articles that were real articles, not blog posts. We're talking about, journals and peer reviewed journals and magazines and, all the things that were edited and vetted and approved and so on to understand the writing style, but also understand the core approaches. We have named frameworks that have been derived from all of our content, right? So we have decades of content, thousands and thousands of pages. All of this has been extracted and built into methodology. So I've extracted for our best practices for, say, taxonomy development, and there's multiple templates, there's multiple frameworks, there's multiple processes. And what that does is it takes the same expertise that a very senior level information architect would use in order to do this. So it's the training content for the LLM. Now we have the ability to do this in an semi-automated fashion. This is not completely automated. You still need a human in the loop, but it accelerates the things that the machines can do well in terms of pattern recognition, but it also applies the frameworks based on that IP. And again, we've harvested years and years of work to ingest this so that this tool can then go in and build the knowledge architecture. It can build the taxonomies. It can derive the taxonomies. It can recommend the content models. We have frameworks. Here's a template. Here's what a content model needs to look like for this system, that system. Here's what product data needs to look like. Here are the processes for deriving it. And all of that accelerates the ability to do things like componentize that content across those large sets, to be able to generate the information architecture from those source documents and from those interviews and from those process steps, to be able to create the content with those metadata defined schemas, to be able to leverage and operationalize all of that expertise into these systems that are auditable and defensible and repeatable. And this has allowed us to do things by an increase of a factor of 10, right? 10x improvement in efficiency. So the things that were practically difficult, right, or too costly, or that's taken away now. What used to cost, what we did a project to do ontology and knowledge graph that normally would have taken 12 to 18 months. We did it in 8 weeks, maybe eight to 10 weeks. So it's huge, massive improvements in the process and the efficiency, and it's done by applying methodologies with the tools. So that's what's really exciting about this to us, is the fact that we can do this work so much more quickly and effectively. Now we're going to talk about the deployment. So again, look at the timelines here. We're talking about 10 weeks right now, and we're talking about 12 weeks, the whole thing. Now that may be aggressive. That's going to depend on your organization, but we're really talking about doing this stuff in a 3 month time frame, and 3 to 4 month time frame. Yeah, 3 month. But it really does take a lot of planning. It takes a lot of preparation and so on. But again, what we want to do is we want to be able to understand how our users are going to help us, right? As experts, we need to build the test cases against a golden set, right? We need a golden set of questions and answers, because that becomes a source of ground truth. And then when we are in production, we have signals. When people give it a thumbs down, or they dispute the answer, or they say it's wrong, we bring the SMEs into the system to look at those, of where the system is pointing. So that's the involvement both before and after the process. But we're doing very proactive testing in front, right, before we're doing things, and then we're looking at the signals in response. So this is where we need to leverage our subject matter experts, because this is a continually evolving process. And we need to integrate workflows so that on an ongoing basis, as people give it a thumbs down or they have a question about it, we can feed that back into the process and be able to understand why we had a wrong answer. Now, many times it's the user. They didn't know how to ask the question. They asked it in a way that the system couldn't resolve. It's like walking into Home Depot and saying tools, right? What do you want to know about tools, right? You have to say refrigerant. Well, what do you want to know about that? Many times the content may be missing, or it could be untagged, so the retriever can't get it, or the chunking is not done correctly. So that's where we have the ability to deconstruct and measure, and then make changes, and then measure again. So it's always that iterative process of measuring and having a way of iterating through this. So what do we know? When do we know it's done? It's when we are benchmarking the accuracy against the ground truth, when we are measuring our hallucinations and minimizing those, when we have logic that's to escalate to a subject matter expert or to a human that is defined and operational, when we have governance controls, meaning we need to make decisions about this. We need to make ongoing decisions about who's owning things, and how we're measuring, and how we're allocating resources, and who gets to do what with this. And then we get this SME sign off. And again, it's the deliverable plus the benchmarks before and after. That is the evidence that you need in order to say this is done. So again, what we want to do is we want to make sure we score this on multiple dimensions. So there's lots of ways of defining retrieval quality, right? It's context precision, it's recall, it's the relevance to the answer. There's also the ability to measure the quality of what's done. It's called faithfulness or groundedness. Is it faithful to the content? Is it grounded in the truth? Is it relevant to the user? Is it complete? Is it conclusive, right? And each of these can be measured objectively. These are data measures, right? There's some subjective stuff in there in certain situations, but for the most part, it's very objective. The hallucination rates, the citation accuracy, any PII, those are safety and trust measures that we need to understand. How is it performing? How many tokens are we using? What is the user's perspective on this? Is there any latency? Do we have the ability to tell it, if it is asked a question that's not in its domain, is it going to refuse that? Say, I don't know. Or is it going to try to make up an answer? We need to make sure that we have consistency of those answers, and they have the ability to understand what multiple turns are going to look like, and it's stable. And then, of course, how successful is it, right? What's the task success? What's the deflection rate? Thumbs up, thumbs down, escalations, and so on. Those are really the important benchmarks, and these are all things that can be measured. And here's what we measured from a particular initiative, right? So we measured groundedness, and we said, what was the current performance? What's the industry benchmark, the enterprise benchmark? This is saying the AI factually and accurately responded, right? And it was supported by their outputs. Relevance. Did the AI response address the question? Coherence. Is it well structured? Is it easy to understand? Latency. How long did it take for this? Citation rate. What percentage of responses have a citation? These are all important metrics, and these can be automated. And then when we have things like, I don't know, well, what does it mean and what is the rate around that? So what we find is that, when you have certain types of content, it's much more difficult to retrieve answers. And so again, it really, there's a lot of ways of deconstructing this and measuring it. Whoops. And finally, we have the roadmap. So how do we scale this? How do we build this out? And the roadmap is starting to look at other use cases that are prioritized by business impact. This is what we're trying to do. And then the sequence is expanding the model, hardening the government, extending it to new lines, integrating the downstream applications, looking at new content sources, and so on. And so what this does is it gives us a sequence plan. It's not a strict waterfall. You can do things in parallel, but it's credible and it shows you where to go. And again, you can extend this roadmap out as far as you want, and it can be more comprehensive or less comprehensive depending on what you're doing. So the sequence comes from the diagnostic, from the organizational gaps. Organizations might sequence things a little bit differently, but you need to be able to incorporate those needs and those priorities into the process. And what this becomes is a grounded plan. It's grounded in evidence. It shows you where you're going to have impact and where you can tackle it next. And so it becomes a very cohesive process. One last poll. Let's go ahead and see if we can get you guys wake up a little bit. But which of the 5 pilot phases would be hardest for your organization right now? Discovery, design, transformation, deployment, or scaling. So I see some stuff, and again, this is what's the most important, right? Because you might have trouble with lots of them, but it looks like designing and building is challenging. It really cuts across the board here. Give you another couple of minutes to respond to this, but I'm glad people are still awake and paying attention. So thank you for that. And then we're going to wrap up in just a moment or two. Explaining to leadership why we're not done yet and we need a roadmap, right? Getting governance to sign off and agreeing on metrics, transforming the content, engineering the content, building that semantic layer, right? All of these are challenging areas, but I can see that some of these are, the design and the expansion is very important. So let's go ahead and, okay, so we're sharing it. You can see that these issues cut across different areas. So here's the synthesis. This is what's important. We started with foundational capabilities and why it's important. We looked at where the gap is in most organizations, and it's usually foundational, right? And then pilots, purgatory comes from not having the right order and missing many of the foundation pieces and not benchmarking, not budgeting, not sponsoring. So those are the things that are going to get in your way. So one of the things you want to do is ask the questions. What does our content need before it can be use AI? And then what foundational area is weakest? And then what do we need to do about that? What is it costing us? What's the right first use case for a pilot? What would we build? So those are the questions you need to answer. Now, if you want to do this, let's talk, right? You can go to that URL. You can use the QR code or you can send a note to me, Seth at Earley.com. Don't try phone. That voicemail system is a little wonky, but with that, I think we're going to end it. Oh, we also will give you a free scorecard. This is not the full readiness quick check because it won't have the remediation, but it'll give you the scorecard. It'll say where you are. So you'd have to fill this survey out, and we'll send you the scorecard itself, but that's just the scores. It doesn't have all the remediation processes. That's something that, we'd want to get into a more serious conversation about in order to do that. So take a look at that as well. And with that, I will let you all go. Thank you for your time, Heather. Wonderful job. Thank you. And thank you to Carolyn and to our sponsors. So with that, have a wonderful day. And it looks like I gave you 1 minute back to your day. 2 minutes. I gave you 2 minutes back to your day. Don't spend it all in one place. Thanks, everybody. And we'll talk to you soon. Hope to hear from you.